we should be good.
All right, excellent. Thank you to everyone who's been able to join in so far, and we're excited to get started here in the New York offices during Climate Week with Mike Mann, Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science and the Director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State. You're all very familiar with his work already, mostly from being enrolled with the course. From your comments, we can see that there are some very insightful questions that we want to get to today. We have a list from those that I've posted online in the forum section already, but for those of you who want to stay engaged and interested with the content as we're going through these courses and these questions right now, please just write in along the side and we'll try to get to your questions. Mike, would you like to say anything before we start the first question?
Sure thing. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but hopefully folks are finding that link now. It's a very exciting time to be talking about this issue about human-caused climate change because, of course, it's Climate Week here in New York City. The UN Climate Summit is taking place this week, and I'm here to participate in events related to that, and so that allowed us to actually do this event live from New York City. So thanks to those of you who have joined the course, who are in the course, and we will address questions that are specific, that relate to course material. I know many of you have some specific questions, but I think we'll start out maybe with some of the more general questions that have been posed, and that'll open up the discussion. And I guess we're going to go until about 2 p.m. So we've got a solid hour, better part of an hour to do this. And so without further ado, I think we will get going.
Mm-hmm. The first question is one that has received an awful lot of attention on the forums. It was asked by Eric Dahlstrom, who have responded to it, but just a more thorough answer maybe, where can you find trusted information on climate science? He suggests resources such as the IPCC reports, Skeptical Science. We've seen feedback around Real Climate and climate communication. But where is the best place to be looking for this information?
Of course, our MOOC is no. There are many good sources out there. Of course, in the wild west of the internet, there's a lot of bad information out there as well. And so it's important to know both where to go for reliable information about the basic science. And some of those sites that we've already mentioned, of course, the IPCC. You can find the summary for policymakers of the IPCC reports online. They're fairly accessible. Real Climate is a website that we co-founded back in 2005 that sort of deals with issues related to climate science at a fairly high level. But there are sites, as we already heard, like Skeptical Science, that really break down the science at sort of a pretty elementary level. In fact, there is a list of sort of the 100+ leading climate change denial talking points and myths on that site, and responses to them at the beginner, intermediate, and advanced level. And that's really useful because we have seen a lot of misinformation and climate disinformation over the past few weeks in the lead up to the Children's Climate March and the UN Climate Summit. There's a lot of misinformation that's being promoted out there. And so it's important to know where to go to get good information and to sort of gather information, links and resources that are helpful in rebutting some of the misinformation that's out there. And of course, there are many who probably won't be won over by facts and logic and information because they see this issue from an ideological standpoint rather than a scientific one. But there are many sort of innocent, honest people who are sort of caught in the middle, confused by the misinformation that's out there. And so it is important to refute it on their behalf. So some of the sites, we've mentioned them. Of course, there are government websites, NOAA's website, the National Science Foundation, National Academies of Sciences websites, climate.gov, at least the information that still remains there on the government's climate website. Some of it has disappeared in the past few years. But there are a lot of resources out there, trusted resources, government websites, websites run by scientists and scientific organizations. One of my favorites is Climate Communication. It's a website maintained by Science Communicator. And there are a lot of very useful resources there as well. So those are the ones that come to the top of my head here.
Mm-hmm. Those are good resources for people of any sort of level. There was a specific question by Lewis Conway asking about what key concepts from mechanisms and driving the climate system could be incorporated into climate adaptation for curriculum, specifically for architects. Now, that question for architecture specifically, but what other sorts of ideas and curriculums would you like to see becoming more mainstreamed in education?
Yeah, it's a great question. The arts, architecture, I see sort of being part of world, the humanities. It's so important to reach out to the other disciplines, because climate change is not just a scientific problem. It's fundamentally a societal problem. It's an ethical issue. Our ethical obligation not to degrade this planet for future generations. And so the humanities and ethics and philosophy comes into the discussion. And it's extremely important to communicate not just the science to the public, but the implications of the science. And a lot of those implications are societal in nature. They are ethical in nature. And that means we need all of the tools and all the communities sort of joining together in that larger effort to communicate the science and its implications to the public. And that means that we do need artists, we need the arts, we need the architects, we need the the world of sort of entertainment, Hollywood, engaging people with narratives, with stories that help communicate the science and its implications. I think architects, we think of the great Buckminster Fuller, sort of our role on this planet and the fragility of our environment, the concept of spaceship Earth. And Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, communicated through his architecture sort of our civilization, human beings living in harmony with nature. I have the luxury of living in the state, Pennsylvania, that is home to falling water, and I can't get there often enough because it really does capture that concept that we need to live harmoniously with nature. And of course, that relates to larger issues of sustainability, which is what this program, this UN program, is about. And climate change, of course, is at the center of these issues of sustainability. So it's a long-winded answer. The bottom line is I embrace, and I've talked to architects and artists, and there are many who are out there who realize that this is a really important opportunity to engage the public and to explain why climate change is much larger than just a scientific issue. It affects everything. It affects the world around us and our place in it.
While we're on the question of architecture then, we had one participant in Dublin, Ireland, who asked with a question on the cost effectiveness of rooftop wind turbines in urban areas. She says, are rooftop wind turbines worth considering in this sort of environment? How long roughly would you think before the cost of installations are made back? And does that make them useful tools and resources for us at the present state?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are larger sort of questions about renewable energy and the efficacy or the cost effectiveness of renewable energy. Well, of course, that depends on our societal priorities, right? And part of the problem right now, and part of the solution, of course, is to make sure that the damages, the cost of inaction, the cost of climate change impacts is built into the economic decision-making process, the cost-benefit analysis when it comes to pricing different forms of energy. So we need to incentivize renewable energy, wind, solar, rooftop solar. It should be cheaper for you to get energy that way than to get energy by burning fossil fuels, because burning fossil fuels is doing damage across the board to every sector of civilization. And this is why, while personal action is important, and I often talk about the importance of doing everything we can to reduce our own individual carbon footprint, it's essential that we see collective action. We band together and we put pressure on our policymakers, and that's what's happening this week here in New York City at the international level, is bringing that pressure to bear to make sure that we offer people solutions that are not more expensive. It shouldn't be more expensive to get your energy from sources that are not degrading the planet. And so we need to make sure that our politicians support incentives, subsidies for renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, et cetera. And the only way that's going to happen, of course, is if we bring pressure to bear by voting for politicians who are willing to do something about it, and voting out those politicians who won't, and bringing pressure to bear in every other way. We have a voice, and we all have a voice, and we need to use it. So that's, but the bottom line is it shouldn't cost you more to get energy from solar and wind than from fossil fuels. It's great if you're willing to do that just because you value doing something about this problem. And I've chosen to do that. I get all of my power from renewable energy. We have a plugicity, which is from renewable measures in my own life to try to minimize my carbon footprint. If it's not more expensive, those carbon-friendly truly conquer this problem.
Another region-based question, now that we've talked about a few different countries.
We have a term for that, and it's discussed in the course. It's Arctic amplification or polar amplification, and it has to do with so much more warming in Alaska. And it turns out that what happens in the Arctic, as my good friend Susan Joy Hassel likes to say, doesn't stay in the Arctic. When you warm the Arctic and you change temperatures there, that actually modifies the behavior of the global atmosphere. It changes the behavior of the jet stream in a way that gives us more of those stuck extreme weather patterns that we've seen here during the summer in the United States and in Europe and around the entire planet, in fact. It's changing weather patterns in a way that gives us more of those really persistent, devastating extremes, the wildfires and floods and heat waves and superstorms, droughts that we've seen in recent years are being amplified by this behavior of the jet stream, which it turns out is related to what's happening up in the Arctic.
Building on that, B. Wilda asks, how valid are the rumors which circulate over the internet that the newest climate models are actually suggest that the climate is much more sensitive than they previously expected, which in turn means that even more radical action is needed to spare the worst? Is it still possible, and how do you see this timeline?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there is certainly a grain of truth to that a number of the models that have been examined in the new IPCC assessment higher what we call climate sensitivity. They do warn more for a given increase in greenhouse gas concentrations than those same models did in the past, older versions of those models. And we've seen this sort of go up and down. In the last IPCC assessment, the sensitivities of some of the models were surprisingly low. They were lower than they had before. And inevitably, we're going to see these sorts of variations back and forth as scientists put more realistic processes into the model. And as you do that, it turns out when you start putting new things in the model, sometimes that leads to problems in behavior in other parts of your model. It takes a while for everything sort of to work together. It takes additional work to identify how changing one process might have implications for other processes in the model so that your model is behaving. And is in fact that we're seeing an increase in climate sensitivity because some of the changes that are being made, for example, on cloud properties and what we call boundary layer properties, the convection in the atmosphere and clouds have a very important impact on the radiation budget, on the warming of the surface. And so I wouldn't put too much emphasis on these sort of fluctuations from one generation to the next. We're going to continue to see them. And it turns out we have a whole lot of other natural constraints on this quantity climate sensitivity that we discuss at some depth in the course. It's a key concept. And we have a number of observational contents as discussed in the course, observational constraints that tell us the climate sensitivity probably has to be in some range. No matter what the models do, we know that the planet cooled down a certain amount at the height of the last ice age, 20-something thousand years ago. We know that the planet warmed up a certain amount in some of the past geological periods where CO2 concentrations were very high, like the early Cretaceous period, where they were several times larger than pre-industrial CO2 levels, probably in the thousands of parts per million. So all of these different lines of evidence, how much the climate cools down in response to a big volcanic eruption. There are all these different pieces of evidence that collectively constrain climate sensitivity that tell us it's probably in the range of 2 to 4 degrees. The most likely value probably about 3 degrees. And regardless of the fluctuations and the sensitivities of these climate models, all of this other collective evidence tells us that it's probably somewhere around there. And when you start seeing climate sensitivities of 5 or 6 degrees Celsius, twice the central estimate, what we think is the most likely estimate, typically that's an outlier. And we might not be surprised that the next generation of that very model will see the climate sensitivity come down. So don't get too concerned about these fluctuations from one assessment to the next in individual models. The collective evidence tells us that the climate system is sensitive enough. If 3 degrees Celsius warming for a CO2 doubling means that we're on a path to see 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, whether or not we start worrying about some of the outliers, some of the high sensitivity models. Just what we know with some confidence is enough reason for concern and for concerted action.
Very good. Speaking about concerned and conservative action, a lot of questions have been coming through on this message board as we're going through live. One question is, what are your thoughts on the Great Green Wall, the proposed forest across the Sahara Desert? And another is, how much should this resilient planning, moving from the coasts, et cetera, taking realistic human actions?
Yeah, so, I'll treat both of those separately. I'm going to put the Great Green Wall in the category of geoengineering, and we talk a fair amount in the course. There's a whole module section of a chapter on geoengineering, which is sort of the intentional additional manipulation of the Earth system in a way to try to influence the warming of the planet. And some of the schemes that have been discussed and again are discussed in the course, like injecting sulfur particles into the stratosphere to block out some of the sunlight to try to offset the warming effect of greenhouse gases, or dumping iron into the ocean to try to fertilize that draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. As we start to examine these mechanisms in more detail, we find that there are potential unintended consequences, potentially dire unintended consequences. If we start tampering with a system we don't understand perfectly, we could end up even worse off than if we had not engaged in some of these interventions. So my own view when it comes to geoengineering is the much safer route to stabilizing the climate is to solve the problem at its source. The continued burning of fossil fuels to draw down those CO2 and greenhouse gas concentrations from the atmosphere, to stop the activity, the burning of fossil fuels that continues to elevate the concentrations of those greenhouse gases. And when it comes to trying to green the Earth by manipulating the land surface or painting massive painting rooftops white, for example, is something that's sometimes talked about. Some of these things relatively harmless, but their impact would be modest compared to the impact of simply not continuing to burn fossil fuels. So I always come back to that.
In the message boards on the course, there have been a lot of activity around radiation questions. Brian J. Leary, who's been quite active on a lot of the discussion boards, asks a IR-specific question that's gotten a lot of attention in the discussions. He says, Dr. Mann, would you suggest some resources that explain more fully how CO2 would behave when energized by SW and LW radiation sources? Could you say a few words on this, provide a brief overview to the others listening?
Sure. So, this course sort of tackles the science at a somewhat intermediate level, because we wanted it to be broadly accessible to people without a whole lot of math and physics. And I've heard from some of you who are already a little concerned about the math and physics that we do in the course. So there's a little bit of that, because it is important to understand, some of the mathematics and the physics behind the way the climate system operates. But we've refrained from really going into some of the nitty-gritty details. There are other MOOCs and courses that are out there that really do go into that in some additional detail. David Archer of the University of Chicago has an online course where he actually allows you to get your hands dirty with a radiation code. You can go in there and actually use the numerical codes, which are pretty complicated, that determine sort of on a line-by-line basis in the spectrum, the absorption of different wavelengths of electromagnetic energy radiation by the different greenhouse gases. And it's a really instructive exercise, but it requires a fair amount of tolerance for some pretty detailed math and physics. So for those of you who are interested in getting into that, I will hereby promote a competitor's online course and refer you, for example, to David Archer's course, where you really can get into some of the nitty-gritty behind, for example, the radiation codes that are used in climate models. And it is really interesting to get into those details. And it is, for example, one of the things you learn is that as you increase CO2 more and more, you get a little bit less warming for each additional amount of CO2 that you put into the atmosphere. There's a sort of diminishing returns effect, which is good. Otherwise, the climate change problem would be far worse than it actually is. And it almost follows a logarithmic sort of mathematical trajectory, which is to say that, for example, for each doubling, it's geometric, the effect is geometric. For each doubling of CO2 concentrations, you get a certain amount of warming. So to get the same amount of warming from 280 to 560 parts per million, pre-industrial, to where we're headed if we don't act somewhere later this century, you now have to go from 560 up to 1100 and something, double 560, to get the same amount of warming. And then up into 2000 and something ppm to get the same amount of warming. So there's a diminishing returns there. Again, it's largely logarithmic. And that's why we can talk about climate sensitivity in terms of the amount of warming you get, not for an increase, say, of 100 parts per million, but for a doubling of CO2 concentrations. For each doubling, you get the same amount of warming. And that's because it is a logarithmic relationship. And to understand that, why that's true, you actually have to look in detail at the nitty-gritty of the line-by-line behavior in these radiation codes. And it turns out when you do that, you see it has to do with the saturation of radiation bands. As you put more and more CO2 in there, you've already blocked out a lot of that window of absorption. So adding more gives you diminishing returns. And you can only really understand that at a fundamental level by getting into the math and physics. And there are other places to do that, but we don't do that in this course.
Mm-hmm. More or less building on that, Stacy Clark of Dallas talks about, she has a question specific to the carbon balance and just how that can be projected over the next few decades. You've talked over time, but can you say maybe specific to that?
Sure thing. Hi, Stacy. I know Stacy. Good to hear from you. Sometimes we make projections that are physically based, right? And the climate models are physically based projections. They're based on the laws of physics and mathematics that describes them. And there's uncertainty because there are uncertainties in the processes. We've talked about some of those uncertainties, for example, the behavior of clouds. So predicting physical behavior is one thing. It's predicated on the laws of physics. Predicting human behavior is far more complicated because it's based on politics and sociology and psychology and all these other things. Predicting the future evolution of greenhouse gas concentrations, well, of course, that depends a lot on what we do. If we decide to act, if this week here in New York City, leaders across decide to truly get serious, are compelled by the arguments that our children are making and decide that now we really do have to act before it's too late, then we could see actions that will keep CO2 concentrations below, say, 450 parts per million. Pre-industrial levels were about 280 parts per million. We're now at about 410 or 412 parts per million. If we continue to burn fossil fuels at historic rates, if we follow the historical trajectory, we'll hit 450 parts per million in a matter of a couple decades. And at that point, we think we commit to 2 degrees warming Celsius, a little less than 4 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet, enough warming to really start to yield some of the more damaging and potentially irreversible climate change impacts. So what that tells us is that we have to take concerted action now if we're going to prevent crossing that 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. That means bringing carbon emissions not just to a peak, which they sort of are starting to do. They were stable for 3 years. They ticked up a year ago, and now it looks like the 2019 numbers are actually, we're seeing a little bit of a tick down. So we're sort of right now wobbling. We're sort of seeing this sort of variation about what looks to be a flat line. So we've stopped the sharp increase. We've sort of come to a peak, but that's not enough. If we want to avoid reaching 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, again, we're at 412 or so, and historically we were adding about 3 a year. So if you do the math, 450 in a couple decades. In order to avoid getting there, we now have to bring those carbon emissions down probably by about 5% a year for the next decade. If we want to keep them at an even lower level, that will limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which a lot of nations have said that even that is too much warming. And that's been recently one of the targets that's been held out, keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Green New Deal is sort of premised on the notion that we have to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, to do that, we've got to bring carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 over the next decade, which is the main source of that common talking point that we have to basically act within the next 12 years. We only have 12 years left to act. That's a simplification of what is true, that over the next decade, because 12 years, 2 years ago, really, so now we're at 10 years, over the next decade, we've got to come down from that peak to about half of that peak. And by mid-century, 2050, we've got to be zero emissions, carbon neutral, if we are going to avoid breaching that dangerous level of 1.5, let alone 2 degrees Celsius warming.
Building on what you said there about the need for human action, and specifically what we as humans can do to take action, Patrick Summer in North Dakota has asked about just basically the role that we can play in this narrative. Have we reached a point where governance and accountability are far more needed than individual action? Would our individual actions be better spent writing, lobbying, protesting, rather than counting pounds of carbons in our Prius? What do you see as the balance?
Thanks. That's a great question. It gets to the heart of sort of something that we're really contending with today. It's become a fairly fractious debate, I think a divisive debate. And I don't doubt that some of the mischief makers are actually fanning the flames of that divisive debate. Because if they can get us arguing over individual versus collective action, if they can divide the sort of community of climate advocates and activists, then they can prevent the sort of unified voice and action that's necessary to truly tackle this problem. So we have to recognize that there is a role for both. They're not unrelated. Ultimately, collective action is individual action, en masse. And whether it's voting in order to affect elections and determine which politicians come into power and which get booted out of office, that comes down to collective action made up of individuals voting. We all have a voice and we all have participation in that process. Of course, children don't, and so it's all the more important that we listen to them and we recognize that we have a responsibility to vote in their interests because they don't have that voice at the voting booth. So that's collective action made up of individual action. And we, as I said before, we need incentives that move us in the right direction because some of us will do everything we can to minimize our carbon footprint because we know it's the right thing to do. But economists understand that if you want to see sort of mass behavioral shifts, then you need what they call a price signal. You need market incentives. You need to incentivize that behavior. And that's why we need a price on carbon, and we need incentives for renewable energy. And we need politicians who are willing to support those policies. That having been said, again, when it comes to individual action and doing everything we can, we're also using our voice. When we do something, when we make a conscious decision, and we do it visibly in a way that our friends and family members and neighbors can see, it communicates to them, right? So if we, take measures in our own lives to reduce our carbon footprint, then others see us doing that. And that has sort of a multiplier effect. And so it is important to do those things while recognizing to see the mass behavioral shift that we need if we're really going to accomplish this massive decarbonization of our economy over a timescale of a decade. We need incentives, and we need to make sure that we use our voice and our power at the voting booth and elsewhere to ensure that we get the policies necessary to get that shift in behavior.
The use of our voice is very strongly felt throughout that last action. There's a lot of feedback and questions coming through live right now, just asking what is the best way that you can craft your voice, or how can you use your voice to those who are denying climate change? What is the best way to face up to this conversation?
Yeah, thanks to those of you out there asking that question, because it is so important. And in the weeks leading up to the Children's Climate March and Climate Week here in New York City, we have seen a massive deployment of trolls and bots by the forces of inaction who are trying to divide us, who are trying to confuse us, who are trying to prevent this transition that is potentially just around the corner. And they are threatened. They're threatened by the children. Greta Thunberg is a real hero to so many of us. The Swedish 16-year-old Swedish girl who has sort of become the face of the children's climate movement. She was referred to by OPEC, this consortium of oil producers, as the greatest threat to them. The greatest threat to the fossil fuel industry is these children because of the moral authority of their voice and the commanding nature of this movement. And so we need to have their back. They are under attack online and elsewhere. We need to be supporting them. We need to be doing everything we can to fight back, to report trolls and bots, to get them taken down when they are engaged in abusive behavior. We need to correct the misinformation and the disinformation that's being put out by them, not because we're going to convince, you're not going to convince a bot, it's programmed to do that. And most trolls you're not going to convince either, because they're so driven by ideology that it's not about facts anymore. It's about an agenda. It's about ideology. But they are infecting the larger discourse. They're confusing honest, well-meaning people. And so that's why we do combat their misinformation, and we push back at it, not to convince the disinformers, but to make sure that they don't infect a larger population. Because if you look at the latest polling, it's only in the single digits. I think 9% of the public is actually what you might call an active climate change denier. They're a small fraction of the public, but they have a voice that's out of proportion with their numbers, in the form of the megaphone of the right-wing media and because of trolls and bots online. So one of the most important things you can do is fight back against that misinformation and disinformation, but also make sure to pivot to the positive case. You can't win purely by defense. It's football season. We know that you need an offense as well. Penn State could use a little bit more of it. But anyways, you need an offense as well as a defense. And that means that you really do have to make the positive case as well, bring people along. So you pivot, you refute the misinformation and the disinformation, but you replace it with a positive message that people can take. Because one of the great threats right now to action is actually doom and gloom, and this notion that it's too late to do anything. And the latest polling suggests that nearly as many people think we shouldn't act on climate because it's too late as think we shouldn't act because climate change is a myth, a hoax. So doom and gloom, and the purveying of doom and gloom has now become a real threat, a real impediment to action. We have to fight back against that because it is not too late to act on this problem. And saying it's too late is a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom.
More broadly, on a large scale, can you just speak to the actions of governments, to the actions of the processes that are in place, just about accountability generally, but about how you would like to see the conversation moving forward in the future?
Yeah, so accountability is a very important part of it. Politicians being accountable to representing the people rather than the special interests, the fossil fuel interests who too often fund their campaigns. And right now we have that problem here in the United States, where we have a Congress that has largely been bought by fossil fuel interests. Many on one side of the aisle, in particular, of course, the Republican side of the aisle, who have long denied that climate change is real. And we're sort of seeing maybe some movement there, moving away from outright denial to starting to participate in a more meaningful conversation about what to do about the problem. We're seeing some Republicans move in that direction. And I think that's thanks. That's a testament to the power of the social movements that we have seen, the children's climate movement, the call for a Green New Deal, whether or not you agree with all the policies, what it's done is it's moved the whole conversation, because many congressional Republicans, the last thing they want is what they see as a heavy-handed regulatory approach to solving this problem, which is what the Green New Deal would do. They're much more supportive of market-driven approaches. And so I think that the threat of what they see as a heavy-handed regulatory approach, the threat of a Green New Deal, has actually moved them into the fold now of the meaningful conversation. And that's fine. We should have a healthy, vigorous debate about the policies that we put in place to solve this problem. There's a worthy debate to be had about that. So accountability is making sure that politicians are willing to participate in that constructive discussion. And if they're not, if they continue to deny that there's a problem or do everything they can to resist taking any actions to deal with the problem, then we have to hold them accountable. And one of the ways we hold them accountable is by voting. And in this next presidential election, where we're going to determine the composition of our Congress, as well as the President of the United States, that is an extremely opportunity to determine the direction we want to go and whether there is going to be accountability for politicians who deny and delay when it comes to climate action.
And another question that's come up.
My wife is calling me. I will.
She's probably watching. Some of the questions that have come through the feed as we're sitting here are asking about solutions and asking about the solutions that we ourselves or that business can take to move away from business as usual. What do you think are the most effective solutions, and when do you think that a return on investment or just generally a return will be seen by these solutions?
Yeah, so what we have to do is price what's known as an externality. When we burn fossil fuels, we do all this damage, and we're seeing that damage. We're seeing unprecedented extreme weather events that are costing us literally hundreds of billions of dollars. In fact, by some measure, climate change-related damages are costing us in the trillions of dollars globally and gross domestic product already, and that will just get more and more as we go on. So the cost of inaction, of not acting, is far greater than the cost of action. And that means that we need to internalize that some way. A price on carbon, incentives for renewable energy, a price on carbon. Should that be a carbon tax? And if so, should it be a revenue neutral carbon tax? Well, that's a legitimate thing to debate politically. Or, cap and trade, emission permits. There are various ways to do this, or explicit incentives for renewable energy and taking away existing incentives, misplaced incentives for fossil fuels. There are all these different lever arms that we have when it comes to the economy. And I do think that we need to, when it comes to combating climate change, again, individual action matters, political action matters, and there are a lot of great ideas in the Green New Deal that are appropriate and can help solve this problem. But one thing that isn't quite articulated as clearly as I would like to see in the Green New Deal is the need for a price on carbon. Is a very sort of full-throated defense of putting a price on carbon. It is an economic measure. It is, market economics. And I know some people don't like market economics. They don't trust industry. They don't trust corporations. They don't trust capitalism. I understand where that's coming from, but we have to work within the system that exists. And that means making sure that the damage done by burning fossil fuels is priced in the economy. There's a price on carbon. And I refrain from trying to dictate what form that should take. That's for our politicians to decide. What pricing mechanisms, the role of subsidies versus explicit prices on carbon. That's a worthy debate to be had, but we need a price signal in there.
While we're on the subject of economics, there was a message left early in our discussion. Can you talk about the economics of rising sea levels specifically?
Sure. Literally hundreds of millions of people are threatened by the sea level rise that may occur now simply from the warming that's already happened. We've warmed the planet enough that we're starting to destabilize substantial parts of the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet, enough ice that if it truly does collapse, as we think it may, in response simply to the warming that's happened so far, then that gives us not feet, but meters, potentially 20 feet of sea level rise. How quickly will that happen? The best of the current science tells us we probably have centuries. But if there's any pattern that we've seen with every assessment, those projections have increased. And we're about to get a special report from the IPCC this week on the cryosphere, on ice and sea level rise. And my guess is that new report will tell us, once again, it'll be a ratcheting up of how much sea level rise we think we could get simply from the warming that's already happened, and of course a lot more if we don't act. It's not abstract anymore when it comes to sea level rise. We're seeing it play out when you have a devastating tropical storm or hurricane that's riding on top of a rising tide of sea level rise. And we're seeing that in Florida, even what's known as sunny day flooding. Simply from seasonal high tides, we're now seeing regular flooding of the streets of Miami Beach and Fort Lauderdale and large parts of the southeastern coast of the U.S. And of course, the devastation that was done by Superstorm Sandy here in New York City and along the Jersey coast. A foot of sea level rise meant that storm surge at Battery Park, New York City, not far from where I'm sitting right now, was 13 feet rather than 12 feet because of global sea level rise. That might sound like a small difference, but that meant 25 additional square miles of flooding and billions of dollars of additional damage. And that's from 1 foot. Imagine what 6 to 8 feet would do. And that's where we could be by the end of the century again, if we don't act on this problem. That would be catastrophic. And it's hard to even estimate what the financial damage would be done and the millions of people who would literally be displaced. Hurricanes posing a monumental risk now to our coastlines. And we're seeing it play out in real time. It's no longer an abstract problem.
While we're on that subject, there is a question that has been echoed a few times here about moving beyond business as usual and that there are different industries doing specific. But can you please say something to across various industries if there's an area that you think there's a bigger disparity that needs to be addressed or anything like that?
Yeah, well, obviously the fossil fuel industry is an industry that ultimately can't exist if we are going to solve this problem. And there are other, too often some will paint business and industry as the enemy. But let's keep in mind that, and here in New York, there are people, there are a whole bunch of folks I know, because I know some of them, and I've heard from them who are here to participate in the UN Summit from the financial markets world and from the world of finance. And they recognize that climate change is a threat to their bottom line. And so you've got people in investment banking, insurance and reinsurance, financial industry, and the finance industry, the finance industry, who are thinking very carefully about the the problem of additional investing in fossil fuels. One of the primary risks is what they call transition risk, which is simply if we decide that most of the assets of these fossil fuel companies have to remain stranded, we have to leave most of the fossil fuels in the ground, the oil, natural gas, and coal in the ground, because we can't afford to warm the planet as much as we will if we continue to burn these fossil fuels. If there is a worldwide recollection that these assets have to remain stranded, then fossil fuel companies very quickly become extremely bad investments because most of their assets will be stranded. They can never draw upon their main assets. And the finance world recognizes that now, and they're starting to think about this transition risk, that it's dangerous to continue to provide financing for fossil fuels for this reason alone. And that's not even taking into account the damage done by climate change, which is something else that the finance industry is thinking about. So understand that the business world isn't a monolithic villain in this matter. There are some villains and some fossil fuel interests in particular who have fought tooth and nail any effort to regulate carbon emissions and move away from fossil fuels. Other energy companies that have been a bit more enlightened, that see the writing on the wall and recognize that they have to move away from fossil fuels. So there's a range even within that industry. But there are other business interests that actually want to be and are being a constructive partner in trying to solve this problem. And we have to recognize that, make space for them, invite them as being part of the larger effort rather than alienate them.
While on the subject of business there, a language question specifically coming through right now. If we started talking about climate as a risk assessment instead of the language of fear, could this make a difference? Or what changes do you think could fundamentally help our articulation here?
Yeah, language is essential, and and we understand that. There are a lot of experts in the world of communication who understand just how important word choice is, and it really is. In my view, we have to make sure that we frame the issue in terms of opportunity. That there's this amazing opportunity to both solve this problem and bring prosperity. We need to provide a vision of a green future, a prosperous future. That is a possibility. That is one future planet, Earth. Another future planet, Earth, well, Hollywood has already provided an image of that in terms of the dystopian films that portray, a degraded planet. That is a future, a possible future as well. It's up to us to determine which of those futures we will see. And so it's important to make sure that we frame this challenge in terms of opportunity, the opportunity for a prosperous future. And that it isn't just doom and gloom and all the bad things that are happening because of climate change, but the positive future that we can ensure by acting on this problem now and making sure that we don't degrade this planet for our children and grandchildren. There is, as the question alludes to, sometimes we frame this in terms of risk management. And there are people who frame it in that manner. And that's a meaningful way to talk about it. For example, there is the possibility of impacts that are far worse than our best models currently indicate. We can't rule that out. We could be underestimating the problem. And we might look at those scenarios and say, but if they were to come to pass, they would be catastrophic. And so experts in the world of economics and risk assessment will tell you that when that's the case, and we call that the tail of the distribution. There's a bell curve of what's likely to happen. And way off in the distance, at the far right end of the bell curve, are the very low probability events that would nonetheless be catastrophic if they were to happen. We, in our own lives, accommodate that sort of tail risk, as it's called. For example, by purchasing fire insurance for our homes. Most of us won't experience having our house burned down, and yet we pay fire insurance. We're happy to pay out money now to hedge against that catastrophic outcome. And so we can frame climate risk in the same way, that we want to hedge against those worst case outcomes because, as this organization here, as I was touring the office and I saw these stickers that say there is no planet B. And there is no other planet that we can go to if we screw this one up. So we better preserve it. And that is the ultimate lesson when it comes to risk management. So I do think that that can be useful framing. I think we have to be careful that sometimes when we say, well, this is just a problem to be managed, it makes it sound like we just have to tweak things a little bit, like invest a little bit here or a little bit there and we solve the problem. Problem managed. No, we need a fundamental transition in our energy economy and our way of doing things if we're going to tackle this problem. So management might make it sound like it's just a little tweak in our way of doing things in business as usual. And it's not. We need much greater action if we're going to solve this problem. But it is worthwhile to think about aspects of this problem. For example, managing that tail risk, making sure that we hedge against the possibility that climate change impacts will be even worse than we project. And it turns out when you do that properly, the economics tell you to act even faster because of that low probability, but nonetheless catastrophic possibility of what could happen if we don't act.
And speaking of your answer there, hedging our bets, there have been a lot of questions coming through on the conflicting messages and the variety of models that are available right now. Just how would you say that just messages that are being confused or models that seem to show different futures, how would you say that this is affecting the present conversations and the present understandings?
I should note, it looks like the battery here is just about to die. So maybe we can get it plugged in there. We only have 3 minutes, so we might make it, but there isn't much battery there. So it sort of touches on what I was just talking about. When you look at the various models, there's a range of projections, and some models suggest less than the average, and some suggest more than the average. There's uncertainty, and has to do with some of the physical things that we talk about in the course and we've talked about here. The actual nitty-gritty science of climate and the role of clouds and climate sensitivity. So nonetheless, because we have a spread, we don't just have one answer. We have a family of possible futures for any given scenario of fossil fuel burning, of what we choose to do. There's some range among the models of what will happen. And again, economists and people who work in the area of risk will tell you that when you do have that spread, you have to think very carefully about the upper end, even though those scenarios may be less likely to come to pass. If they come to pass, the impacts would be devastating, would be catastrophic. And so it tells you, if you do the economics of this right, if you do the math and you do the economics, what those higher sort of scenarios tell us is that we should invest even faster in decarbonizing our economy. That is the best policy when it comes to managing the risk of our, of whether we have a habitable and sustainable planetary environment.
Excellent. Well, Mike, thank you very much for coming up to the SDG Academy offices in our SDSN New York space. We appreciate your time and insights here. Are there any things that you would like to close down the conversation with, or let them know what you're doing in town here and everything?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm here, in town because I consider this, last week was so important with the children's climate march and sort of reaching a crescendo now with Climate Week here in New York City this week. And so I wanted to be here to participate not just in this event, but in lots of the other events that are happening, that are galvanizing attention at this critical juncture, right? Because there's maybe been more attention garnered about the climate crisis over the last couple weeks than we've seen in years. And we know that we are at this critical juncture, that if we are to avert truly dangerous warming of the planet, we literally do need policy action now. And so to me, there's never been a more important 2-week period than the one that we're in right now. It's focusing attention on climate change. I'm here to do what I can. I will, if you want to look out for me, I'll probably be on 1 or 2 MSNBC programs tomorrow talking about this challenge and this moment and why it's so important for us to act now. And so continue to, if you want, we can continue this conversation online. I'm active on Twitter at Michael E. Mann. I'm also on Instagram at Michael Mann Scientist. So let's continue the conversation online. And for those who are taking the course, thanks so much for doing so. For those who aren't taking the course, or telling your friends who aren't taking the course, it's a great way to start out with an understanding of the science, and then you can branch out. There are all these other courses in the SDG Academy that deal with so many of these other issues in great depth, the politics and the economics and everything else. And so this course, my MOOC, is a sort of a launching point for all of these great online courses that are available through the SDG Academy. So I want to thank the UN and the SDG Academy for allowing me to participate through designing and teaching this course, and for all the work that they're doing at this very important moment where attention is really focused now on this crisis we face and the potential we have to avert a crisis. So thank you all.
Thank you all for joining us. I hope you've had an informative hour. If you do have any more questions, the course will be still running live. It's a self-paced course, so you're welcome to pose questions as they come up. We'll be monitoring it. Mike, you're quite active on that, so this wasn't the last chance you have to ask questions. But thank you very much, and we'll hope to hear from you soon on the course.